Yeah, the African Energy Chambers 2024 Annual Summit is already in motion in Cape Town, South Africa here for today, a very special edition of the African Energy Frontiers for you. Just to piggyback a little bit of some of what we've heard so far today, as far as the energy industry is concerned on the continent, quite a very robust opening formalities from the chairman of the African Energy Chamber, asking Africans to take destiny in their own hands. We also heard from the African Bank President, Dr. Benedict Orama, and he came up with a very interesting ideas, speaking of how African oil and gas producers can leverage the billions of reserves in oil and trillions of cubic of gas to secure international funding to build infrastructure and become competitive within the global energy space. Let's take a listen to that very quickly from Benedict Orama.
Well, we acknowledge the gargantuan task of contending with well-heeled vested interests that will be affected by the disruption of the $30 billion oil import business in Africa. We see financing as a pivotal constraint. African Energy Bank can make a difference only if it is well capitalized and funded. Yet building the refineries and infrastructure towards making the Gulf of Guinea a global refining hub will require billions of US dollars in investment. Where will this money come from? I think that we can find the money by quickly monetizing Africa's oil and gas reserves. I think Mr. Wale Tinubu in his presentation mentioned that the production to reserve ratio in Africa is ridiculous low. We must reverse that, because that is where we will be able to raise the money to make this kind of investments we're talking about. Nobody's going to give it to us. Yeah, because these reserves under the ground estimated at 125 billion barrels of oil and 624 trillion cubic feet of gas, which amount to over $10 trillion US dollars, are today worthless for as long as they stay under the ground. They do not enter Africa's GDP. Can you imagine if we find a way to convince the world to add the $10 trillion to Africa's GDP? We add it to the $3 trillion of GDP, we'll be at 13 trillion, we'll be rubbing shoulders with the US and China. But that is not happening. So it is worthless to us. So it will be more prudent for countries with targeted infrastructure investments, but with no means of funding them, to sell the reserves forward or pledge them for long-term loans. That way, we can transfer the future risk of obsolescence and market risk to the buyers and use the cash to invest in critical infrastructure and activities with proven developmental impact.
Now, talking a bit more about what else we need to do on the continent in terms of energy sustainability, affordability, as well as accessibility, those 3 points were made very clear in terms of ensuring a provision of energy and making energy poverty go away. And that came straight from the Minister of Electricity for South Africa, who's been able to secure 7 straight months of no outage in Africa's most advanced economy. Let's take a listen to the Honorable Minister when he was making that address.
Through our G20 leadership, South Africa is committed to championing an African energy agenda that is bold, just, and rooted in African value system. Together, let us light Africa with power and the promise of progress, sovereignty, sustainability, prosperity for every African citizen. Africa stands on the brink of a transformative era, one where energy will no longer be a barrier to development, but a bridge to our continent's aspirations. We can redefine our energy future through collective resolve, innovative partnership, and a commitment to sustainable growth. As South Africa leads G20, we are dedicated to championing an African energy agenda that addresses our challenges, harnesses our resources, and reflects on our vision for self-reliance and prosperity. Let us seize the moment to build an energy-secure Africa where every community is empowered.
Now, there are a few other conversations from the private sector. Wale Tinubu, who is the group CEO of Owando Nigeria, one of the biggest sponsors of this year's event, of course, spoke about how indigenous energy companies in Africa, including Nigeria, are ramping up their ability to take some of those assets that are being spin off by international energy companies. But speaking from outside the continent, the deputy executive director of the International Energy Agency, Mary Warlick, spoke about how the international energy is supporting Africa's quest for energy and why it is important to have energy sustainability for 1.2 billion people on the African continent. And let's listen to that key point from Ms. Warlick.
Now, let me highlight two areas which the International Energy Agency sees as particularly critical. The first, as has been mentioned, is energy access. Despite progress, we're still far from achieving universal energy access. 600 million people in Africa, roughly 40% of the population, still lack access to electricity, and nearly 1 billion people, some 70% of the population, lack access to clean cooking fuels. The implications of this are vast, not just in terms of the limits it places on education and economic opportunities, but also the health implications. Globally, a lack of clean cooking contributes to 3.7 million premature deaths per year, disproportionately affecting women and children. And according to our analysis, achieving the SDG 7 goals of universal access will require around $30 billion annually between now and 2030, covering both electricity and clean cooking. Now, this is a relatively small number in the global energy investment landscape, about just 1% of total energy investment. But this masks the scale and complexity of the challenge. Investment in electricity access and clean cooking has historically been below $5 billion annually, and affordability concerns make this a particularly difficult area to finance. Additional efforts are therefore needed, anchored in public and concessional finance to achieve universal access. And the second key area is driving investment towards an energy sector geared for industrialization. Many countries across Africa have set their vision on seizing opportunities for renewable energy deployment to leverage industrial development and socioeconomic advancement.
Now, speaking specifically to Africa's biggest oil producer, Nigeria, I sat down for a quick interview with the Minister of State for Petroleum Resources, Heineken Lokobiri, and he brought me up to speed on the new multi-billion-dollar Africa Energy Bank that will be headquartered in Nigeria. We head through the morning and midday session. That is due to take off in February, Nigeria's headquarters. And for that, the head of Afrexim Bank, Dr. Rama, says there should be more funding, capitalization, and support. The first transaction which is expected to be done early next year. But this is what Heineken Lokobiri, the energy minister for Nigeria, told me a few minutes ago about why this is important for Nigeria and the rest of the continent. Let's listen.
The reality is that on the financing side, what gets financed gets built. And at the end of the day, if we don't have financing to develop our oil and gas industry, we will be stuck with those reserves. And the only way of doing that is to ensure that we have our own indigenous institutions, and without a shadow of doubt, the African Export-Import Bank have gone from having a small $1 billion portfolio in the oil and gas industry 10 years ago to having something north of a $10 billion debt portfolio, supporting African indigenous NOCs as well as private sector companies. More private sector, I would say. The NOCs have the capacity to issue sovereign bonds to support their businesses. But the private sector, for example, the point that was mentioned, the 650,000 barrel a day, $20 billion refinery and petrochemicals complex built by Dangote Industries was heavily supported by the African Export-Import Bank, as well as the rest of the industry. We participated in different aspects of the financing in areas of the downstream, like the export of crude-backed deals to support the financing. Economic volatility is another issue. The African nations have suffered substantial devaluation in currency, particularly after the COVID, where there was a lot of easing, quantitative easing done across the world. There's no doubt that focusing on the export would increase the balance of trade, because you export, you enjoy the benefit of foreign exchange. I think it's time that we encouraged even our own African stock exchanges, our African debt markets, our African pension funds to see the oil industry as a fundamental way of being able to export and secure dollars to come back into the economy. The percentage of investments that are made by Africans into the oil sector is minimal, if not non-existent. But yet, the oil sector holds one of the biggest solutions to the foreign currency crisis most of the African countries face.
So we've got a whole lot of grounds to cover over the next few days till the end of the week. Friday, technically, when the summit here will be coming to a close. But we've got off to a very good start in terms of the soundbites that's needed. New definition of climate justice. Why Africa needs energy justice, needs energy poverty to go to industrialize, to provide social development across board. But the key message is that the time is now for Africa to take its destiny in its own hands, to find funding support through local banks, the DFIs and other sources, and continue to work with the rest of the world to meet those sustainable development goals that will make the planet more cleaner, safer, and better for everyone. From Cape Town, South Africa, I am Boston Omofayo reporting for Frontier Africa Reports.